Dorothy had meant to fix it. She had written it on the list taped to the register, the same list that held 40 other small
Here it
surrenders,
is, all
small
there.
repairs,
Looks right.
small things that
Thanks.
kept
Be
sliding to the
careful out
bottom
there.
because there was
Always am.
always something more urgent.
Hello,
A
what's
cracked
wrong?
tile near the back
You
booth,
need to get out.
a
now.
coffee urn that sputtered on
Okay,
cold
I'm
mornings,
going.
the leak under the prep sink that only bled when it rained hard. The sign stayed broken. It buzzed and blinked and cast its red-orange glow onto the wet asphalt of Highway 31 like a warning no one heeded. And on most nights, Dorothy Reeves decided that a flickering sign was still better than no sign at all. It was 11:45 on a Tuesday evening in late October. The air outside smelled of pine resin and coming rain, the particular wet earth smell of an Alabama October that she had known her entire life. Inside Reeves' table, it smelled the way it always smelled, bacon grease, soaked into 40 years of wood lemon polish on the counter, old coffee warming in a pot that had seen better decades. Dorothy stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a roll that was technically a retired dish towel, working in the slow automatic circles of a woman who had performed this exact motion so many thousand times that her hands no longer needed instruction from her brain. She was 63 years old. She stood broad-shouldered and unhurried, her skin the deep brown of aged mahogany, her hair pulled back in a tight gray twist that she had stopped fighting sometime around her 58th birthday. Her hands were large and sure. Her eyes were the kind of dark that doesn't reflect light so much as absorb it, eyes that had seen enough of the world to remain thoroughly unimpressed by most of what it still had to offer. Her knees ached when rain was coming. They were aching now. The diner held 3 customers at this hour. Old Mr. Granger occupied his permanent residence in the corner booth, nursing a slice of pecan pie and a newspaper he had been reading since 7 o'clock. 2 young men Dorothy vaguely recognized as nephews of someone from the county road crew sat at the far end of the counter, working through the last of the Tuesday meatloaf special. Nobody was talking. The television above the coffee station played local news on mute. A weather graphic showed a yellow band of rain moving northeast across Alabama. From the kitchen came the rhythmic scraping of a metal spatula against the flat-top grill. Theo Webb, 24 years old, was cleaning up with the particular intensity of a young man who treated every closing task as practice for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Theo had been working at Reeves' table for 11 months. He was saving money for culinary school in Birmingham. He was the best natural cook Dorothy had encountered in 4 decades of running this place, and she had told him so exactly once in a tone that made it sound like a warning rather than a compliment, which was the only way she knew to tell someone something important without making them soft about it. Closing in 15 Granger, Dorothy called out, her voice carrying the particular rasp of a woman who had been using it at full volume for most of her adult life. "I hear you, Dot," the old man said, not looking up from the sports section. "Just finishing the crust." Dorothy wrung out her rag over the sink behind the counter. She looked at the television. The weather graphic had been replaced by a segment about road construction on I-65. She looked at the clock above the pass-through window. 11:47. She was thinking about the leak under the prep sink. She was thinking about whether she had enough sausage patties for the morning rush. She was thinking about none of these things in particular, and all of them at once in the low-grade constant arithmetic of a woman who had been running a small business alone for 8 years. She was not thinking about what was about to happen. The sound came first as a vibration, something felt in the sternum, before it was heard by the ears. Then it arrived fully tearing through the quiet of Highway 31, like something mechanical in serious distress. Not the deep, rhythmic pulse of a motorcycle running well. This was a high, ragged scream of an engine being pushed far past the point of dignity, accompanied by something underneath it, a grinding, desperate quality, like the sound of a machine being asked to do the one thing it no longer had the ability to do. Dorothy put down the rag. She walked to the large front window and looked out through the glass into the wet dark of the parking lot. The headlight appeared first, a single white beam swinging wildly as the motorcycle crossed the yellow line of the highway entrance at a speed that was entirely wrong for the angle. Gravel sprayed, the bike fishtailed, the rear tire caught and then broke loose again, and for one long moment the whole machine seemed to be deciding whether to stay upright or surrender entirely. It stayed upright, barely. The rider brought it to a stop in the middle of the lot with the kind of controlled violence that only comes from someone who has been on a motorcycle long enough to have made peace with the possibility of dying on one. He dismounted and the bike listed, and he caught it and put down the kickstand with the mechanical focus of someone operating on the very last margin of their physical capability. Then he turned toward the diner, and Dorothy saw the dark stain on his white t-shirt. Even at this distance, through glass and the buzzing orange light of the broken sign, she could see that the stain was large and still spreading. He was pressing his left arm against his side the way a person presses when they are trying to hold something in, and he was walking toward her front door with the particular gait of a large man whose legs have been informed that the situation is serious, but whose legs have not yet fully accepted this information. He was enormous, 6'4" at minimum, with the kind of build that suggested he had never once in his life been the smallest person in any room he entered. A beard that reached his chest, arms the circumference of most people's thighs. On the back of his leather, cut visible as he turned slightly to push through the door, the rocker read in bold arc letters, Hell's Road. Dorothy had already turned away from the window. Theo, she said, her voice dropping to the register she used when things required doing immediately. First aid kit, right now. There was a beat from the kitchen, the sound of a spatula being set down on a counter. Yes, ma'am. The front door opened. The bell above it, the small brass bell that had announced every customer for 31 years, made its small, cheerful sound, which was deeply wrong for the occasion. The man came through the door and caught himself on the frame, and then he moved to the counter stool and got most of the way onto it before his body made its opinion about vertical orientation clearly known. He sat heavily, both hands pressed to his left side now, his face the gray-white color of a man whose blood had somewhere more important to be than his face. Up close, he was younger than the beer suggested, maybe early 30s. His eyes, when they found Dorothy's, held the specific expression of a person who has just done something that required more courage than they were sure they possessed, and who was now hoping very hard that it was worth it. Help, he said. His voice was wet. Please. Dorothy had crossed the room while he was still talking. She had seen blood before. 31 years of Highway 31 passing her front door had included 4 car accidents bad enough that people had come to her before they could get anywhere else. She had seen what broken glass and twisted metal did to human bodies. She had held pressure on wounds with dish towels while waiting for ambulances that took a long time to come to this part of Harlan County. She was not a medical professional and had never claimed to be one, but she knew the difference between bleeding that was serious and bleeding that would kill a man if nobody did anything about it in the next few minutes. This was the second kind. She pulled his hand away from his side and looked at the wound. Not a gunshot. The tear in his flesh was jagged and irregular, the kind of injury that comes from impact with something sharp and unforgiving at speed. Road debris, maybe. Or the edge of something metal if he'd gone down and slid. The cut was deep enough to be ugly and shallow enough that she had time, but it was bleeding with the enthusiasm of a wound that had not been given any reason to stop. Sit straight, she said. Don't lean. I know, Dorothy said. Sit straight. Behind her, she heard the bell above the door a second time. She did not turn around. She kept her hands where they were. Step away from him, Dot. The voice belonged to Deputy Colt Briggs. She recognized it the same way she recognized the sound of a particular kind of bad weather, not with fear exactly, but with the deep weariness of someone who has dealt with this specific disruption many times and finds it no less tedious for its familiarity. She turned then, not quickly, not because she had been told to, but because she had decided to. Colt Briggs was 29 years old, which Dorothy considered to be the most dangerous possible age for a man who had been given a badge and told he was important. He had a face that was conventionally good-looking, in a way that had probably done him no favors in terms of developing character, and he wore his uniform with the particular pressed precision of a man who had confused the appearance of authority with its actual substance. His hand rested on the grip of his service weapon with the casual placement of someone who wanted you to notice it was there. She had known Colt Briggs since he was 11 years old, stealing Slim Jims from the gas station on Route 9. She had known his mother, who was a decent enough woman, saddled with the difficulty of raising a boy who had decided very early that rules were for people who hadn't figured out how to avoid them. It was a gesture of absolute geological stillness, the body language of a woman communicating that she had become a fixed feature of the landscape and would need to be treated accordingly. Briggs's jaw tightened. He looked at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling, partially obscured by the little flag of an Alabama pennant that had been there since 1987. Dorothy did not look at the camera. She kept her eyes on Briggs. The camera was not recording. It hadn't been recording since 2009, when the system it was connected to had finally given up, and Dorothy had decided a visible camera was probably as effective as a working one for deterrent purposes. She had never gotten around to replacing the system, which was on the list on the register, along with the flickering sign and the prep sink and the cracked tile. Briggs didn't know it wasn't recording. He was doing the math that people do when they are considering an action in front of a camera, and the math was taking long enough to be useful. "You're obstructing Dot," he said. "I'm running a diner," she said. "Theo, bring me that kit." Theo crossed the room with the deliberate care of a young man trying very hard not to make any sudden movements that might change the emotional temperature of the situation. He set the first aid kit on the counter and stepped back. Dorothy opened it. She pulled out gauze and medical tape and a package of antiseptic wipes and set them in a row on the counter with the efficient precision of long practice. Briggs unholstered his taser. The crackle of it filled the diner. Mr. Granger in the corner stopped pretending to read his newspaper. The two young men at the counter had rotated fully on their stools to face the scene with the expressions of people who were calculating whether to leave or whether they had already waited too long to leave without making things worse. "Move away from him," Briggs said, "or I will remove you." Dorothy did not move. She pressed a folded square of gauze against the wound and held it there with steady pressure and looked at Colt Briggs over her shoulder with an expression that was not anger and was not fear and was not a challenge in any theatrical sense. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things. It was the expression of a woman communicating that she had made a decision and that the decision was final and that the quality of the next few minutes would depend entirely on whether the other person in this conversation was willing to accept that. "You tase me, Colt," she said, her voice very even. "You better hope my heart gives out. Because if I wake up, the first call I make is to the state police. The second one is to Channel 6 in Birmingham, and the third one is to your mother, in that order." The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences Dorothy could remember in 31 years of running this diner. The neon sign buzzed outside. Briggs looked at the camera. He holstered the taser. It was not a surrender. His eyes made that clear. It was a postponement, and the terms of the postponement were written on his face as plainly as anything Dorothy had ever read. He took 2 steps back toward the door, pulled out his radio, and spoke into it in a low voice that she couldn't fully make out. "Patch him up," Briggs said, finally looking at her. "But don't think this changes anything. When I walk out of here with him, you and I are going to have a different conversation, Dot. Count on that." "I'll be here," Dorothy said and turned back to the wound. The man on the stool, she still didn't know his name, had been watching all of this with the particular stillness of someone who was in enough pain that stillness has become the most available option. His face was still gray-white. The sweat stood out on his forehead in small, bright drops under the diner lights. He was watching Dorothy with an expression that had something new in it now, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite confusion, but occupied some territory adjacent to all three. "Why?" he said quietly. Dorothy didn't look up from what she was doing. She was cleaning the wound with antiseptic, working carefully at the edges, where the debris from the road had mixed with the blood. "Because you're in my diner," she said, "and you're bleeding, and in here that's enough." "They could shut you down," he said. "They could try by him," Dorothy said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. She could feel him watching her. "Ridley," he said then, just the one word, his name. "Dorothy," she said, "but most people call me Dot, and most people are wrong to think that's an invitation." Something moved through his expression that might in better circumstances have been the beginning of a smile. She worked quickly. The wound needed more than she could give it with a first aid kit, and she told him so directly, which was the only way she told anyone anything. He needed a hospital. He needed stitches. What he was getting tonight was pressure and gauze, and something to hold it until the situation clarified. It took 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock above the pass-through window. When she was done, Briggs came back through the door and collected Ridley with a thoroughness that was efficient and unkind. He said nothing to Dorothy during this process. He didn't need to. As he walked Ridley through the door with one hand on the back of the man's cut, he paused just long enough to lean toward Dorothy's counter and say quietly enough that only she could hear it. Lee said, in 2 months, health inspector's been asking about diners on the 31 corridor. Then he was gone. The bell above the door made its small, cheerful sound. Dorothy stood at the counter for a moment without moving. Then she picked up her rag and went back to wiping down the counter. Closing in 5 Granger, she said. She sent Theo home at midnight. She sent the 2 young men shortly after. She walked Mr. Granger to his truck herself because it had started to rain, and he was 81 and the parking lot was uneven, which was also on the list on the register. Then she came back inside and locked the door and turned off all the lights except the one above the counter, and she sat in booth 4 with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and the baseball bat that had belonged to Earl, and she thought the bat had been Earl's before it was hers. He'd played slow-pitch softball with the County Employees League on Thursday evenings for 20 years until the Tuesdays and Thursdays got taken over by the chemo appointments, and then by other things, and then by nothing. The bat was aluminum dented near the barrel from a particularly good hit he'd made in the summer of 2003, the summer of the best year, the one she measured other years against. She had kept it behind the counter since the year he died, which was 8 years ago, which was somehow still a number that surprised her when she counted it. Earl had built this diner, not figuratively, literally. He had poured the foundation himself with 2 cousins in a rented concrete mixer on a July weekend in 1987. He had framed the walls and hung the drywall and tiled the floor in the pattern Dorothy had drawn on graph paper at the kitchen table of the apartment they were renting on Maple Street. He had done the electrical work himself, which was not entirely legal, and had required 3 subsequent electricians to correct over the years, but it had worked well enough for a long time, which was Earl's approach to most things. He had also turned down 3 separate offers from a regional restaurant group that had wanted to buy the property and put in a chain breakfast concept which Dorothy considered to be among the finest decisions of his life, and possibly of anyone's life. He had used the phrase "over my dead body" on all 3 occasions with increasing sincerity until eventually it stopped being figurative. The diner was all she had left of him. The building, the booths, the counter with the dent in the corner where he had dropped a full industrial coffee urn during installation and never fully repaired it. The list on the register that kept getting longer because fixing things cost money, and money was the one ingredient that had always been in short supply. She sat in booth 4 with the bat in the cooling coffee and listened to the rain on the roof and thought about what she had done and what it was likely to cost her. She was not naive about what Ridley was. A man in a Hell's Road cut in the middle of the night on a highway in rural Alabama was not riding a charity route. She knew what those patches meant. She had read the newspaper long enough and lived in this part of the country long enough to have a realistic understanding of what kinds of things moved through the corridors of the rural South at night and who moved them and under what arrangements. She was not a foolish woman, and she did not intend to become one. But the man had been bleeding, and she had been a person who could help, and there had not been a version of herself available in that moment who was capable of making any other choice. Earl would have done the same thing. This was not a comforting thought so much as a statement of fact. She dozed off sometime around 1 in the morning, her head against the back of the booth, the bat across her lap. The phone woke her at 1:15. She came out of sleep with the practiced stride of someone accustomed to being needed in the middle of the night. She was on her feet and at the phone in 3 steps, and she picked it up before the second ring was fully complete. "Reeves' table," she said. "We're closed." "Is this the woman who stood up for the man with the badge?" The voice on the other end was male and low, and carried the particular weight of a person who had developed the habit of being heard without raising their volume. Not threatening, not warm. Something in the careful middle. Dorothy's hand tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" "My name is Preacher. I'm a friend of Ridley's. He got 1 phone call." A pause. "He didn't call a lawyer." Dorothy absorbed this. Outside, the rain intensified briefly against the front windows and then eased. She looked at the clock on the wall. 1:16. "I don't want any trouble," she said. "He was hurt. I helped him. That's the whole story." The deputy, Preacher said. "Was Ridley on his feet when they left?" "He was. Briggs wasn't gentle, but the bleeding had stopped." "And he made threats?" Dorothy considered the question and the person asking it. There was a particular quality to the directness, not aggressive but very complete. The kind of directness that comes from someone who has learned that gathering accurate information is more valuable than most other activities. He mentioned my lease, she said, and the health inspector. Hmm. A sound that managed to carry a significant amount of meaning for 2 letters. Listen, Dorothy said. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I'm asking you not to do it here. I have a business to run. I have employees. I'm not looking to be in the middle of something. There was a pause, long enough to be deliberate. You're already in the middle of it, Preacher said. Not unkindly. You put yourself there tonight. What I'm calling to tell you is that we don't forget that kind of thing. And what I'm asking you to do is keep your head down tomorrow morning. Dorothy waited. It might get loud, he said. The line went dead. She stood at the phone for a moment after holding the receiver, the dial tone filling the quiet diner. Then she hung it up and looked at the bat on the booth seat and the cold coffee on the table and the rain-streaked window with the highway beyond it. She did not go home that night. She turned off the last light, sat back down in booth 4, laid the bat across her lap, and waited for morning. She slept again eventually, and her sleep was shallow and full of distant engine sounds. And at one point she dreamed of Earl standing at the grill in the kitchen with his apron on and his back to her. And she called his name, and he turned around and said something she couldn't hear. And she woke up and it was dark, and the rain had stopped, and the highway was empty and silent outside the window. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and started the coffee. It was 5:47 in the morning. She had a diner to open. By 7:30, the regulars had begun arriving with the reliability that Dorothy had come to depend on, in the way that farmers depended on seasonal patterns, not blindly, but with an earned confidence that the pattern had proven itself over sufficient time to be trusted. Mrs. Theo arrived at 7 and tied on his apron and looked at her with the careful attention of a young man who had noticed that something was different about this morning without being able to fully articulate what. You sleep here, he asked. Booth 4, she said. He looked at the bat which she had moved behind the counter. He didn't ask about the bat. At 7:58, Dorothy was refilling Pastor Davis's coffee when she noticed that her hand was very slightly unsteady. She noticed this in the detached, observational way that she noticed most things about herself as data rather than drama. Her hand was unsteady because she had not slept enough and had drunk too much coffee, and because somewhere underneath the routine of the morning, the part of her that was not made of habit and endurance was quietly paying attention to a frequency she couldn't quite name. She set down the coffee pot and stood still for a moment. The cup on Pastor Davis's table had begun to tremble, very slightly at first, the surface of the coffee catching some vibration from somewhere, shivering in tiny concentric rings the way water shivered in the movies right before the thing that was coming came. Then the silverware on the counter began to rattle a small, persistent chiming of metal against ceramic. Then Dorothy felt it in the soles of her feet through the floor, a deep rhythmic pulse like the earth itself had developed a heartbeat. Earthquake, Mrs. Higgins said, looking at her coffee cup with great concern. Dorothy didn't answer. She walked to the front window. She could hear it now. Not one engine, not 10. Something that transcended the category of sound and entered the category of weather, a rolling, enormous, directional thing that was coming down Highway 31 from the south and getting louder with each passing second. The Bellamy brothers had turned on their stools. Theo had come out of the kitchen and was standing in the pass-through window with a spatula in his hand. Pastor Davis stood up. He looked out the window. He said very quietly, "Good Lord Almighty." And then the first of them came around the bend in the highway, and then the second, and then what seemed like all of them at once, a procession of chrome and black leather that took up both lanes of Highway 31 and stretched back further than Dorothy could see the morning sun catching the handlebars and helmets and turning the whole moving mass into something that flickered and glinted like a river of broken light. They were not going fast. They had slowed to a deliberate pace, measured and formal, the way a procession moves when it wants to be seen. The lead rider raised a fist, and the column slowed further as it turned, all of it, the whole impossible length of it turning into the gravel lot of Reeves' table, with a precision that seemed unreasonable, given the scale of the thing. They parked with the orderly efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. The lot filled in 30 seconds. They parked on the grass and on the sidewalk and along both shoulders of the highway for a quarter-mile in each direction. One by one, 2 by 2 in clusters of 5 and 10 the engines cut. The silence that followed was one of the strangest things Dorothy had ever stood inside. 200 motorcycles, 200 engines, all of them breathing and ticking in the sudden quiet under the Alabama sky. Different patches on different cuts, different colors on different vests, but they had ridden together, all of them, down the same highway at the same pace. And now they stood beside their machines with their arms crossed and their eyes on the diner, and the particular patience of people who have arrived at the place they intended to arrive at and are in no hurry about what happens next. Inside the diner, nobody moved. Mrs. Higgins had her hand over her mouth. The Bellamy brothers had both turned completely around on their stools and appeared to be considering the geometry of a situation they had not previously had occasion to consider. Theo had stopped holding the spatula somewhere and was standing in the kitchen doorway with both hands flat on the frame. Pastor Davis was still standing at his table looking out the window, his eggs going cold behind him. Dorothy watched through the glass as the crowd in the lot parted slightly near the highway entrance, the way a crowd parts when someone moves through it with sufficient certainty about their direction. The man who walked toward her door was older than most of the others. His beard held more gray than black. His face had the quality of something that had been exposed to considerable weather over a considerable period of time and had arrived at its current form through processes that were not gentle but were thorough. He wore a cut like the others, but the patch on his chest said what his bearing already communicated. Clearly, President. He walked to the door without hurrying. The bell above it made its small, entirely inadequate sound. He came inside and let the door close behind him and stood for a moment taking in the room with the unhurried thoroughness of a man accustomed to walking into situations and reading them accurately before committing to any particular approach. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, cold and clear, and containing a great deal of distance. He looked at Dorothy. "You Dorothy Reeves," he said. "I am," she said. She had moved without quite deciding to the center of the space behind the counter, standing with both hands resting on the surface, looking at him straight on. Her voice was steady. Her knees were not aching anymore, which happened sometimes when adrenaline replaced whatever chemistry produced the ache. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest. Mrs. Higgins made a sound. He pulled out a folded bill and smoothed it on the counter. $100. He looked at it. Then he looked up at Dorothy. "Coffee," he said. "Black, for the boys." Dorothy looked at the $100 bill. She looked at the man in front of her. She looked out the window at the 200 men standing in her parking lot under the Alabama sky patient, and still. And then she looked back at the man who had put $100 on her counter and was waiting for coffee. "I'm going to need more coffee," Dorothy said. The man's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had arrived at the correct place and was acknowledging that fact internally. "We got time," he said. Then from outside came the sound of a single car engine, a familiar engine, a sheriff's department cruiser rolling slowly past on Highway 31, slowing further as the driver registered what 200 motorcycles parked along a county highway looked like at 8 in the morning. Dorothy watched from behind the counter as 200 men turned their heads in the same direction at the same moment with the collective, unhurried attention of something very large that has been disturbed. The cruiser slowed to nearly a stop. Through the windshield at this distance, she could see the shape of a face she recognized. Deputy Colt Briggs. He sat in his cruiser and looked at 200 bikers who were looking at him, and the thing that played across his face in the moment before he accelerated away was something Dorothy had never seen there before. She recognized it because she had felt it herself on various occasions over 63 years of a life that had not always been kind. It was fear. Briggs hit the gas. The cruiser moved quickly down Highway 31 and kept going. Preacher, she had heard the name on the phone, and it fit him the way certain names fit certain people, turned back from the window to Dorothy with that not-quite smile still in place. "Looks like you've got some security this morning," he said. Dorothy picked up the coffee pot. "Don't push it," she said. "You want eggs with that?" The chaos of the morning settled into something resembling order the way floodwater settles, not cleanly, not completely, but enough that you could move through it without drowning. Dorothy ran her kitchen the way she had always run it, which was the way a woman runs something she built from nothing, and intends to keep with absolute clarity about what needed to happen and absolute intolerance for anything that slowed that process down. She called orders through the pass-through window. She poured coffee with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had poured approximately 1 million cups of it and expected to pour 1 million more. She moved behind her counter with the particular economy of motion that comes from 31 years of working in the same narrow space. The fact that her dining room currently contained men with names like Wrench and Goliath and a prospect everyone called Sketch, who couldn't have been older than 22, did not change the fundamental calculus of the operation. They were hungry. She had food. These were the terms of the relationship, and Dorothy intended to honor them with the same professionalism she brought to every other Tuesday morning in the history of Reeves' table. Goliath was the one who surprised her first. He was the largest human being Dorothy had seen in person outside of a television broadcast, 6'6" at minimum, with the kind of physical mass that suggested he had been built for a purpose that required considerably more structural material than average. He had a skull tattoo that covered the left side of his face from jawline to temple, and his arms were so heavily decorated with ink that the original skin color was something you had to search for. He sat at the counter with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that looked in his grip like a piece of doll furniture. He had asked for the mug to be refilled 3 times. He had said please each time. When Dorothy brought out a plate for the man to his left and set it down without comment, Goliath looked at it and then looked at her with an expression of genuine reverence. "Is that scratch gravy?" he said. "Has been for 31 years," Dorothy said. "My grandmother made scratch gravy," Goliath said with the specific gravity of a man reporting something of considerable importance. "Most grandmothers did," Dorothy said. "Most people just don't know how to ask for it anymore." Goliath looked at his empty plate he had finished before she'd had a chance to register that he had started and then back up at her. "Could I get some, please?" "You could," Dorothy said and took the plate back. At the far booth, the one Dorothy thought of as booth 3, because it was her least favorite, Mrs. Higgins had made a complete transformation from the woman who had been covering her mouth in silent alarm 20 minutes ago. She was now fully engaged in a conversation with a biker named Wrench, who had a scar running from his left ear to his chin and the general facial topography of someone who had spent significant time on the wrong side of various disagreements. Wrench was nodding seriously apparently in response to something Mrs. Higgins had said about her grandson's performance at third base in the county Little League Championships. "You need range at third," Wrench said. "Pure range, the arms secondary." "That's exactly what his coach says," Mrs. Higgins said, and pointed at Wrench as if he had just confirmed something she had long suspected. Thea was running. Dorothy could see it in the way he was moving through the kitchen, not panicked, but operating at the outer limit of his capacity, the way a good engine runs at high RPM. He was cracking eggs 4 at a time, working 3 burners simultaneously, calling out to Dorothy when something was ready with the clipped efficiency of someone who had stopped having extra words to spare. She had known for 11 months that he was better than this job, and this morning was confirmation of it. Under pressure, he accelerated rather than collapsed. That was the thing you couldn't teach. She had decided sometime between the first and second round of coffee orders that she was going to tell him so. Directly, not obliquely. He deserved to hear it plainly. But not yet. There was a diner to run. Preacher sat at the counter. He had been there since he came in, occupying the stool closest to the register with the settled permanence of a man who had identified the most strategically advantageous position in the room and was in no hurry to vacate it. He drank his coffee slowly. He watched everything. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in the low, deliberate register of someone who had learned that most things communicated at volume could be communicated more effectively without it. Dorothy refilled his mug, without being asked the 4th time she had done so, and he looked up at her with those pale winter eyes and said, "You run a tight operation." "I run a clean one," Dorothy said. "There's a difference." Preacher considered this. "There is," he agreed. Dorothy put down the coffee pot and looked at him directly. She had been deciding since the phone call at 1:15 whether to say what she was about to say, and she had decided that she was going to say it because she was 63 years old and had stopped having the patience for indirection sometime in her mid-40s. "Why are you really here, Preacher?" she said. "The coffee's good, but it's not 200 miles good." He turned the mug on the counter, once, a slow rotation. "Ridley is my nephew," he said. "My sister's boy." He paused. "He's reckless, hot-headed, makes decisions the way a young man makes decisions, which is to say he makes them fast and he makes them wrong, and he makes them in exactly the situations where taking your time would cost you the least." Another pause. "But he's mine." Dorothy said nothing. She was listening. "When he called me last night, Preacher said the first thing he said wasn't that he was in jail. The first thing he said was that a woman had stood in front of a loaded weapon for him, that she treated him like a human being when the badge on the other side of the room was treating him like something to be processed. He looked at her. He said she looked at him like he mattered. Dorothy picked up her rag. She was quiet for a moment. He was bleeding in my diner, she said. That made him my business. Lots of people bleed, Preacher said quietly. Most folks in that situation would have stepped back. Let the deputy do what deputies do, especially here. He looked at the room around them, the highway outside, the county road signs visible through the glass, the particular geography of a small rural Alabama town. Especially to someone like Ridley. Dorothy folded the rag. I'm not most folks, she said. No, Preacher said. You are not. He drank his coffee. Briggs, he said, then setting the mug down. He's not just a bad cop. I know what he is, Dorothy said. The speed traps on 31, Preacher said. The cash that goes into evidence and doesn't come out the other side. The arrangement with whoever's running product through the county. He looked at her. We know about Harlan County. We've known for a while. Ridley wasn't here entirely by accident. We've been watching this corridor. Dorothy absorbed this. It rearranged several things she had been thinking. So Ridley was passing through, Preacher said, doing what I asked him to do, which was ride the 31 and see what Briggs's boys did with solo riders at night. A brief pause. He found out. He found out, Dorothy repeated. He found out, Preacher confirmed. And now he's in the county lockup and you're standing in a diner with a condemned lease and Briggs thinks he's won something. Dorothy looked out the window. The parking lot was still full. The men beside their machines were still patient, still watchful. The highway beyond them was ordinary traffic, ordinary morning. The absolute normalcy of the world continuing to function at the perimeter of something that was not normal at all. What is it you think is going to happen next? She said. Preacher looked at his coffee. What I think, he said, is that a man like Briggs doesn't stop when he's ahead. He pushes, because pushing is the only thing that's ever worked for him. He looked at her. And what I think is that when he pushes, he's going to underestimate you. Because men like Briggs always underestimate the person who's already beaten them once. Dorothy said nothing. We're just here to make sure, Preacher said, that when he pushes, he's pushing into something solid. It was at this moment that Dorothy heard the car. Not the sound of it exactly, she heard many cars. But she heard the specific deceleration of a vehicle slowing in the lot, and then the sound of doors, and she looked up, and through the window, she saw a man in a gray suit carrying a clipboard, flanked by two uniformed officers she didn't recognize. Behind them, just visible at the edge of her window's frame, was the front quarter panel of a sheriff's department cruiser. And behind that, wearing his uniform, and standing with his thumbs in his belt, in the posture of a man who has arrived to collect something he considers already his, was Deputy Colt Briggs. He had brought reinforcements. He had not brought them to arrest anyone. He had brought them to do something that required paperwork, which was frequently worse. Dorothy set down her coffee pot. She moved around the counter and walked to the center of the room and stood there while the door opened and the man in the gray suit stepped inside and stopped and looked at the room full of bikers and performed a visible recalibration of whatever he had been prepared to encounter. He was Walt Greer. Dorothy knew him. He had been the county fire marshal for 9 years. He played golf on Sunday mornings with Sheriff Boyd Utter at the public course on Route 12. He was not, in Dorothy's estimation, a man with a great deal of independent moral conviction, which made him the kind of person that other people found useful. He held his clipboard with both hands and looked at his paperwork and looked at the room and looked back at his paperwork. Mrs. Dorothy Reeves, he said. That's me, Dorothy said. I'm Walt Greer County Fire Marshal. We received an anonymous tip this morning regarding potential code violations at this establishment. He looked at the room again. And based on my preliminary visual assessment, I'm going to need to conduct an inspection. The room had changed. It was not loud. There was no shouting, no movement, no visible escalation of the kind that announces itself. What happened was a stilling, the particular quality of silence that descends when a large number of people, who have been going about their business, all stop going about their business simultaneously and redirect their full attention to a single point. The 40 or so bikers who were inside had all stopped eating, all stopped talking. All turned toward the door, and the man in the gray suit in the slow synchronous way of something very large becoming very focused. Greer felt it. Dorothy could see him feel it. His grip on the clipboard tightened. Briggs appeared in the doorway behind him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had prepared himself for a certain type of morning and was now having a different type of morning than he had prepared for, but who had committed to his course of action sufficiently that retreating from it was no longer a real option. Overcrowding is the primary concern, Greer said, his voice maintaining a professional register that was costing him something. Maximum occupancy for this structure is, he looked at his clipboard, 62 persons. I count significantly more than that. I count customers, Dorothy said. I count people eating breakfast. Since when is doing good business a violation? The voice came from somewhere behind Dorothy, low and even. Preacher had not moved from his stool. He had not raised his voice. But the words arrived with the weight of something considerably larger than the words themselves. Greer's eyes moved to Preacher and then quickly away. It's not the occupancy alone, Greer said. We have reports of structural issues, electrical, ventilation. He was reading now, moving down a list. Given the scope of the concerns, I'm revoking the occupancy permit pending a full investigation. Dorothy felt the words land in her chest the way a physical thing lands, not sharp but heavy. The weight of them pressing down on the specific place where she kept the things she could not afford to lose. 6 months. The investigation. 6 months was longer than the 2 months remaining on the lease. If she couldn't operate, she couldn't pay the rent. If she couldn't pay the rent, the lease lapsed. And when the lease lapsed, the county board, which included the uncle of the man currently standing in her doorway, with his thumbs in his belt, would have the property available for whatever purpose suited them. She had seen this play before. She had watched it happen to 3 other businesses on the 31 corridor in the past 5 years. A code complaint here, an inspection there, a lease that quietly failed to renew. The building on the corner that used to be Melvin Patterson's hardware store was now a parking lot for county maintenance vehicles. The woman who had run the laundromat on Route 9 for 20 years had simply stopped running it one morning, and nobody official had seemed particularly troubled by the loss. This was how it was done in places like Harlan County. Not with violence, with paper, with clipboard and badge, and the particular kind of authority that was too boring and too bureaucratic to generate outrage, but was thorough enough to accomplish everything that outrage would have accomplished anyway. Dorothy stood very still. Briggs stepped fully into the room. He looked around at the bikers with the expression of a man performing a confidence he was partially manufacturing. You heard the marshal, he said. Buildings condemned pending inspection. Everyone needs to clear out. He let his eyes move to Preacher. That means you too. Preacher looked at Briggs the way you look at something you are deciding whether or not requires your full attention. Then he looked at Dorothy, and Dorothy looked back at him, and she saw in his face that he understood exactly what was happening, and that he was angry about it, and that the anger was the cold pressurized kind rather than the hot explosive kind, and that he was also underneath the anger, watching her, waiting to see what she would do. Dorothy took off her apron. She did it slowly. She untied it at the back and folded it in the careful way she had been folding it every closing time for 31 years. Lengthwise first, then in thirds, and she set it on the counter with both hands flat on top of it, for a moment feeling the worn cotton under her palms. She looked at Theo through the pass-through window. He was standing at the grill with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing faces do when a young person is watching something happen to someone they care about and does not yet know how to stop it. Go home, Theo, she said. Miss Dorothy. Go home, she said, not harshly, just completely. She walked out from behind her counter for the last time that morning and crossed the room toward the door. The bikers parted without being asked, the crowd creating a corridor for her without a word being spoken. Greer and the 2 unknown officers stepped aside. Briggs did not step aside, but the corridor Dorothy was walking was not aimed at Briggs, and she walked past him without acknowledging his presence in any way that would have been detectable to an outside observer. She pushed through the door and went out into the morning sun. Outside, the men who had been standing by their machines had all turned toward the diner. They were watching with the still collective attention of an audience at the moment when the stage has gone quiet and the essential thing is about to happen. Dorothy walked to her station wagon. It was parked at the back of the lot where she always parked it, in the spot with the cracked asphalt that she had been meaning to patch. She put her hand on the door handle and stood there for a moment with her back to the diner. She could hear Briggs behind her coming out through the door. "I told you, Dot," he said. "I told you last night. You picked the wrong side in this county. This is what it looks like." Dorothy opened the car door. She got in. She put both hands on the steering wheel and sat very still for a moment, looking through the windshield at the highway. She had survived harder things than this. The winter, the heating failed, and she had run space heaters in the dining room for 3 weeks while the repair funds slowly accumulated. The summer, the prep refrigerator went out, and she had lost $2,000 in product over a single weekend. The years after Earl, when getting up each morning required a decision rather than a habit, and she had made that decision every single day, without exception, because the diner was there, and it needed opening, and Earl had not built it to stand empty. She was not going to let Colt Briggs take it. Not with a clipboard, not with a taser, not with a whispered threat about leases and health inspectors. She was 63 years old, and she had outlasted everything this county had thrown at her, and she was going to outlast this too. But she was not going to outlast it by waiting. She reached into the glove compartment and took out her phone. She dialed and waited. "It's Dorothy," she said when Preacher picked up. "That young one, the one with the camera on his jacket? Does that footage include the fire marshal coming in and reading the violations?" A pause. "Every second of it." "Then put it out," Dorothy said. "All of it. Everything from this morning. The marshal, the clipboard, the deputies. Put it out right now." Another pause longer. "That's your call to make," Preacher said. "Not mine." "I know it's my call," Dorothy said. "That's why I'm making it. If they want to fight me with paper, I'll fight them with light. You said shadows have teeth. I'm saying light has more." She heard something on the other end of the line that might have been the quiet acknowledgement of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation. "I'll make a call," Preacher said. "Make it fast," Dorothy said, and hung up. She put the car in reverse and pulled out of the lot and drove down Highway 31 toward home, watching in her rearview mirror as the condemned sticker went up on the glass of her front door, orange and bright in the morning sun, and the 200 men standing on the shoulder of the road watched her go. She drove home and sat at her kitchen table and drank a glass of water and did not cry, which was a decision she made consciously and with full effort. And then she called her cousin Ruth Ann in Montgomery, because Ruth Ann had a practical mind and had survived 3 difficult marriages, which Dorothy considered to be adequate preparation for most of what life could produce. And she told Ruth Ann what had happened, and Ruth Ann said several things that were useful, and several things that were simply the sound of another person sitting with you in a room where something bad had happened, which was its own kind of useful. By 2 in the afternoon, the clip that Sketch's GoPro had captured was accumulating views at a rate that Dorothy, who had a functional but not sophisticated relationship with the internet, found difficult to conceptualize when Theo called her to report it. She thought about Preacher knowing about the way he had said it without surprise he had always known. She thought about what it meant that Briggs had not known and what it meant that Briggs was going to find out. And she thought about the particular mathematics of a corrupt deputy who had just jailed the son of a sitting state senator and issued a retaliatory closure order against the woman who had helped him. She thought about a man walking across a minefield he didn't know was there. "Thank you, Theo," she said. "Go to bed. You were up all night." She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table as the flat gold light of the October afternoon moved slowly across the floor, and she thought about Earl and about the diner and about what came next. Then she poured herself a second glass of water and drank it and decided that what came next was whatever she made of it. The phone rang at 10:15 that night. It was Theo, his voice doing the careful thing again. "The line to the diner is dead," he said. "I tried to call you earlier on the house line and there was nothing. I think," he stopped. "Miss Dorothy, I think someone cut the line." Dorothy stood up from the kitchen table. She had been sitting with tea and the quiet and the bat. "Where are you?" she said. "I'm 3 blocks away," Theo said. "I drove past your house. There's a van, Miss Dorothy, parked down the block, a black van with no plates." Dorothy looked at the kitchen window. The curtains were drawn. The room was lit. "Go around back," she said, "through the Hendersons' yard. You know the gap in the fence." "Miss Dorothy." "Theo," she said, "do you still have your grandfather's shotgun?" A pause, a long one. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Go around back," she said again. "Stay in the dark. And Theo, do not do anything unless I tell you or unless something happens to me first. You understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. Dorothy turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the dark. She heard the crunch of gravel outside. Not a car. Footsteps. More than one set. She heard a voice, low male, familiar in a way that was not welcome. "Dorothy." Briggs, muffled by the door. "Open up. We need to talk about your statement, about what you told the state police." Dorothy moved to the far side of the kitchen, to the corner where the refrigerator met the wall, the place where the dark was deepest. She put her back against the wall. She held the bat. "Go away, Colt," she said. "Open the door, Dot. We've got a warrant. Search and in seizure. Anonymous tip about narcotics on the premises. Gang-related." His voice had the quality of a script being read by someone who knows it's a bad script but has committed to the performance anyway. The warrant was a tool, not a legal instrument. The narcotics were a story to be told after, not a fact to be found. Dorothy understood this clearly. She understood that the point was not to find drugs. The point was to find Dorothy at 11 o'clock at night in a situation from which there would emerge a version of events that Briggs controlled, one that would answer the clip from the morning, one that would give the county board and the fire marshal and the sheriff's office something to point at when the news station from Atlanta called for a comment. She also understood that it was too late and too dark, and she was too alone. The door came in. Not the lock, the frame itself, the wood splintering at the point where the deadbolt met the wall, a sound so sudden and decisive that the dark kitchen seemed to ring with it. Light flooded in from the yard through the open doorway, flashlight beams crossing each other and finding the walls and the furniture, and finally unavoidably finding Dorothy in the corner. Briggs came in first, two others behind him, all three with their weapons drawn. "Down," Briggs said. His voice had lost the conversational quality it had through the door. "On the floor, Dorothy, right now." Dorothy pressed her back against the wall. She held the bat. She was 63 years old, and she was standing in the kitchen that Earl had retiled in 2001, and she was not going to go down on Earl's floor for Colt Briggs. "This is my house," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "You come into my house in the middle of the night with a light and a flashlight, and I am supposed to get on the floor. You're obstructing." "I am standing in my kitchen," Dorothy said. Briggs raised the taser. The back window of the kitchen broke. Not all at once, one pane cleanly, a boot connecting with it from the outside with the kind of deliberate force that is different from accidental breaking, in the way that a statement is different from a noise. Glass came inward onto the tile. Cold night air came through the frame. And then Theo Webb came through the window, one leg over the sill, and then the other straightening up in the broken glass with the ancient shotgun held in both hands, barrel pointed at the center of the room, hands shaking visibly even in the beam of the flashlights. He was 24 years old. He was terrified. He did not lower the gun. "She told you to get out?" Theo said. His voice was shaking too, but the gun was straight. "She gave me this job when nobody else would. You think I'm going to stand outside while you—" "Put it down, son," Briggs said. His voice had gone careful, calculating. "You put yours down," Theo said. The kitchen was very small, 4 people and 3 firearms, and the cold air coming through the broken window and the glass on Earl's retiled floor. Briggs was doing the math that men do in those moments, distance, angle, probability. Dorothy watched him do it, and then the sky outside the broken window turned white. Not the gradual brightening of headlights. A sudden total illumination, as if the night had decided to become daytime for reasons of its own. And with it came the sound rotors, heavy and rhythmic and authoritative, the sound of something institutional and serious and airborne, hovering directly above the house. Then the voice through the megaphone, enormous and calm. "FBI, all persons inside the residence, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Lower your weapons and do not move." Briggs looked at the ceiling as if he could see through it. He looked at Theo, he looked at Dorothy, and in the door frame, visible in the blinding white light from outside, was Preacher. Standing in the splintered doorway with his phone in his hand, the screen facing outward, the little red recording indicator steady and bright. "Hello, America," Preacher said, his voice carrying clearly through the destroyed kitchen, past the broken window, and the broken door, and the men frozen in the flashlight beams. It's about 11 o'clock in Harlan County, Alabama. Briggs lowered the taser. His face in that moment was the face of a man who has run a very long way in a very definite direction and has arrived out of breath and without warning at the edge of something he cannot cross. He holstered the weapon. Outside, through the white blaze of the helicopter light, Dorothy could hear them, the federal agents coming through the yard, in their windbreakers, voices clipped and procedural, the sound of authority that was not Colt Briggs's authority arriving in force. Dorothy stood in her corner, with both hands on Earl's bat, and watched it happen. She had not moved. They came through the yard with flashlights and yellow letters and the efficient, unhurried movement of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had not been in any doubt about how it would end. 4 agents through the back, 3 through the front, 1 at the side gate that Dorothy had never fully closed in 8 years because the latch had rusted sometime in the spring after Earl died and was also on the list on the register. Briggs did not resist. That surprised Dorothy faintly in the part of her mind that was still cataloging details while the rest of her stood in her kitchen corner with both hands on the bat and watched. She had expected him to perform the way he had performed every other time she had seen him, confronted the chest out, the badge forward, the aggressive certainty of a man who had always found that confidence worked as a substitute for legitimacy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson. We have the warehouse meeting on recording racketeering, civil rights violations, and abuse of office. You have the right to remain silent." She continued. Briggs listened. His face had settled into something that was not quite blankness and not quite resignation, something in the territory between them that Dorothy had no name for, the expression of a man hearing the shape of consequences he had always known were theoretical and was now being informed were actual. When the agent finished, she turned Briggs and walked him toward the door with a hand on his elbow, and Dorothy watched him go through the frame of her ruined kitchen doorway and out into the white-lit yard, and then he was past the window line and she couldn't see him anymore. The helicopter moved off. The white blaze softened. The yard returned to the ordinary dark of an October night in Alabama. Dorothy lowered the bat. She became aware that her arms were tired. She had been holding the bat for a long time, and her arms were telling her about it now that the immediate requirement for holding it had passed. She set it against the wall and looked at the glass on Earl's floor, and the broken window frame, and the ruined door, and the cold air coming through both of them. Theo was leaning against the far counter with both hands flat on the surface and his head down, breathing. The shotgun was on the counter beside him. An agent had stepped toward it, and he had let her take it without argument, which Dorothy considered to be the best decision he had made all evening. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his back. He was trembling, the kind of trembling that happens after when the body finally submits the invoice for everything the adrenaline had been covering. "You all right?" she said. He shook his head. Then he nodded. "The clip this morning accelerated the timeline, but they had the warrants before we made the video." He paused. Rafferty talked. "The warehouse meeting 2 nights ago, when Briggs laid out the plan, the gasoline, the vest, the whole frame, they had it on recording. That's where the arson charge comes from." Dorothy nodded. "Rafferty himself," Preacher said. "The man Briggs was protecting. They picked him up 30 minutes ago. He was apparently very cooperative." "Cooperative," Dorothy said, "remarkably so." Preacher looked at the broken window. "I'll have someone fix that by morning." "I'll fix it," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "It's my house," she said. Preacher was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, it is." He turned and went back through the ruined doorway, and Dorothy heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the distant sound of him talking to someone in the yard, low and specific, and then the sound of engines starting up and moving away down the block. And then the night was quiet again, in the way that nights are quiet after something very loud has happened, a quiet that is aware of itself, that carries the recent noise in its texture. Dorothy stood in her kitchen. She stood there for a while. Then she picked up her broom and helped Theo with the glass. The morning arrived the way mornings sometimes do after bad nights, with an almost aggressive brightness. The sky over Harlan County, a hard, clear blue without a cloud in any direction, the air carrying the particular crispness of late October that smelled of dried leaves and distance. Dorothy stood on her porch at 6:15 with a cup of coffee and looked at the street and noted 2 things. The news van from a Birmingham affiliate parked at the end of her block, and a black sedan with government plates parked directly in front of her neighbor's house across the street. The news van she had expected. Theo had called at 5:30 to tell her about it, his voice carrying the particular energy of a young man who had spent the night watching numbers climb on a screen and was still processing what they meant. The sedan she looked at for a longer time. She went inside and drank the rest of her coffee at the kitchen table, looking at the plywood Preacher had sent someone to put over the broken window during the night. He had said he would. She had said she'd do it herself. He had apparently decided that this particular disagreement could be resolved by simply doing it before she was awake to object, which she found irritating and was also grateful for in approximately equal measure. By 8 o'clock, Highway 31 had a quality she had never seen it have before. It was not only the bikers, though the bikers were, there had been there through the night in rotating shifts. It was the other people. Cars slowing at the entrance to Reeves' Table's lot and not pulling in people standing on the far shoulder looking at the condemned sticker on the door, a quality of attention gathering around the place, like the attention that gathers around a scene where something has recently happened and people are still deciding what it means. 3 camera crews by 9. Dorothy drove to the diner at 9:15. She sat in the lot in her station wagon for a moment, looking at the orange condemned sticker on the glass of her door. It was the first time she had seen it from the outside in full daylight, and the orange of it was very bright against the glass. She thought about what Earl would have said about an orange sticker on his door. She thought he would have had a word for it that was not a polite word. She got out of the car. She walked to the door and looked at the sticker. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back to her car and got the putty knife she kept in the glove compartment, and she came back to the door and she worked the blade under the edge of the sticker and she peeled it off. It came away in 3 pieces. She put them in her pocket. She unlocked the door and went inside. The diner was exactly as she had left it. The apron was still folded on the counter. The coffee pot was cold. The pass-through window was dark. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, smelling the particular smell of the place, the grease and the lemon polish and the old wood, and the 40 years of mornings that had accumulated in the walls, and she thought about Earl building this room, his hands on this counter, his boots on this floor. Then she went to the kitchen and turned on the flat-top grill to heat. When Preacher arrived at 9:45 with the 8 members of his crew, she had the coffee going and the grill at temperature and was working through her mental inventory of what she had to cook with. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You're not supposed to be open," he said. "The permit—" "I'm not open," Dorothy said. "I'm cooking breakfast for some people who are going to be here whether the permit says so or not. If that's a violation, somebody can come tell me in person." Preacher looked at her for a long moment. "Goliath," he said over his shoulder, "get in here." Goliath came through the door sideways because the door was not built with Goliath's specific geometry in mind. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at Dorothy. "You know how to run a flat top?" Dorothy said. "My grandmother had one," Goliath said. "Good," Dorothy said. "Wash your hands and tie on an apron. There's extras on the hook by the walk-in." He looked at the row of aprons. They were all floral. He took one without comment and tied it on and washed his hands with the thoroughness of someone who had been taught to do it properly and had retained the lesson. "Wrench," Preacher said. Wrench came in and was directed to the dish station without ceremony. Sketch was sent to run the coffee. Ridley appeared at the door at 10 o'clock, looking pale and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose left side had recently been stitched by a county medical facility and was communicating its opinion of the situation clearly and continuously. Dorothy directed him to the coffee station with strict instructions not to lift anything heavier than a full carafe, which she calculated at approximately 4 pounds, and considered to be within acceptable parameters for a man who was not supposed to be on his feet at all, but who was going to be on his feet regardless of what anyone said about it. "You should be in bed," Dorothy told him. "Yes, ma'am," Ridley said, and began making coffee. By 10:30, the word had spread in the way that words spread in small towns, not through any single channel, but through all channels simultaneously, the cellular osmosis of community that operates faster and more thoroughly than any broadcast medium. People began arriving at Reeves's table with the tentative quality of people approaching something they want to be part of, but are not entirely certain they are entitled to. The first ones through the door were the brave ones. The families who had been pulled over on 31 at 2 in the morning for doing 58 in a 55, and told to pay in cash or find out how long processing at the county lockup took. The young men whose cars had been searched on insufficient pretexts and found to contain nothing illegal, but who had learned that being found to contain nothing illegal did not necessarily mean the end of the conversation. The woman from Route 9 who had run the laundromat for 20 years and had watched it become a parking lot and had never had anyone official explain to her exactly how that had happened. They came in and they sat down and they were served pancakes by a man the size of a refrigerator wearing a floral apron, and they ate. Then came the curious ones. Then came everyone. By 11, the line extended through the door and down the front step and halfway across the parking lot, and Dorothy was running her kitchen with the full operational clarity of a woman in her element, calling orders through the pass-through window and directing traffic at the counter and refilling coffee with the automatic efficiency of 31 years of practice. She was doing what she had always done. She was running her diner. The difference was that her diner was full of people who had needed it to be open in a way they hadn't known how to say until it was nearly taken from them. It was at 11:15, while Dorothy was carrying 2 plates of eggs to the booth by the window, that she saw the vehicles. 3 black SUVs with government plates moving in convoy down Highway 31. They turned into the lot with the measured precision of official vehicles, parking in a line along the far edge, with the particular tidiness of a motorcade that is aware of being observed. The doors opened, aides first, then security, then a man in a dark suit who moved through the parking lot with the particular gait of someone who had spent decades navigating spaces where he was the most significant person present. Silver-haired, square-jawed, the face that Dorothy, who did not follow state politics closely, nevertheless recognized from highway billboards in the specific quality of self-possession that was the occupational characteristic of people who had run for public office enough times to win. Senator Harlan Pruitt. He was taller in person than the billboard suggested. He moved through the lot without stopping for the camera crews who had reorganized themselves around the new development with the frantic efficiency of people whose professional lives consisted of being in the right place at the right moment. He moved past the bikers standing along the building's exterior with crossed arms, and he moved past the line of customers waiting to get in, and he came through the door of Reeves' table with the single-mindedness of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he needed to do when he got there. He looked around the room. He found Preacher. He crossed to him directly. The room had gone quiet in the gradual, pervasive way that a room goes quiet when something is happening that everyone present understands is significant. Not the sharp silence of confrontation, the held breath silence of a moment that people recognize as the kind of moment that gets remembered. Pruitt extended his hand. Preacher looked at it, a long beat, long enough to establish that the handshake when it came was not going to be a formality. Then Preacher took it. "Where is he?" Pruitt said. Preacher nodded toward the coffee station. Pruitt turned. Ridley was behind the counter with a carafe in his hand, looking at his father with the expression of a young man who had been rehearsing this moment in various versions for 2 years and was now discovering that the actual version bore no resemblance to any of them. They looked at each other across the room. Pruitt crossed to the counter. He stopped on the customer side of it. He looked at his son, at the pallor of him, the careful way he was holding himself, the bruised quality around his eyes that came from a night in the county lockup, and a wound that needed more rest than it was getting. "You look terrible," Pruitt said. "Yes, sir," Ridley said. Pruitt put both hands flat on the counter. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'm sorry," he said, quietly. Just those 2 words in the voice of a man for whom they were not easy words, said quietly enough that only Ridley could fully hear them. Something moved through Ridley's face, something that had been held for a long time in a place that storing it had not been good for. He set down the carafe. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Dorothy observed this from the kitchen pass-through. She had been watching while managing 3 orders simultaneously, which was the kind of divided attention that 31 years of running a diner produced. She noted the moment. She filed it in the part of herself that kept track of things that mattered. Then she called to Goliath that the eggs in the upper left pan were going to burn if he didn't flip them in the next 4 seconds, and Goliath said, "Yes, ma'am," and flipped them, and the morning continued. Senator Pruitt held his press conference on the front step of Reeves' table at noon. Dorothy did not attend the press conference. She watched it through the front window while she wiped down the counter which she felt was the appropriate vantage point. The cameras arranged themselves on the highway shoulder. The aides arranged themselves behind the senator. The bikers who were still present in their positions along the building's exterior did not arrange themselves at all, but were present in the background of every shot in a way that Dorothy suspected would generate significant comment in the television coverage. Pruitt spoke for 7 minutes. Dorothy could not hear the words through the glass, but she could see the posture and the cadence, and she had enough experience reading the physical language of official statements to extract the general meaning. He was not performing. That was the first thing she noticed. She had seen enough official statements delivered from the steps of official buildings to recognize the difference between a man who is performing sincerity and a man who is actually in possession of it, and Pruitt at this moment was in possession of something real. 3 days later, a courier arrived at the diner with an envelope from Pruitt's legal office. Inside was the federal injunction, a temporary restraining order blocking the county's enforcement of the occupancy revocation pending a full administrative review. Behind it was a lease renewal, 10 years fixed rate, with a provision against unilateral termination. The county board had signed it that morning. The 2 members connected to the Briggs family had recused themselves. The remaining 3 had voted unanimously. Dorothy read both documents at the counter with a cup of coffee and a calm that she recognized as the calm of a person whose nervous system has simply used up its available capacity for acute response and has moved into a mode of steady, reliable function. She was going to keep the diner. She had known it on the morning she peeled the sticker off the door. She had known it the night she sat in booth 4 with the bat and the cold coffee and decided not to go home. She had known it with the particular deep tissue certainty of a person who has made a decision in a place underneath the level of deliberation, the place where the things you are made of make themselves known. But the documents were official, and official had its own specific weight. She took both documents and the proclamation that Senator Pruitt's office had sent a formal recognition from the state of Alabama for exceptional civic courage, which she found slightly embarrassing in its language, but accepted as the kind of thing that was more for other people than for herself. And she drove to the diner, and she went behind her counter, and she got the hammer from the utility drawer, and she put a nail in the wall to the right of the menu board, and she hung the proclamation there, and she stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to start the coffee. Theo arrived on the Friday with the letter in his hand and the expression of a person who has received news that is good enough to require a moment of verification before they fully believe it. He stood at the counter and put the letter down and looked at it and looked at Dorothy. "It's from the Culinary Institute in Birmingham," he said. "They have a skills scholarship for students who demonstrate." He stopped. He looked at the letter again. The application was submitted by an anonymous group. The scholarship covers 2 years of full tuition. Dorothy poured coffee. "I might know something about that," she said. "Miss Dorothy, you're the best natural cook I've encountered in 31 years, she said. She set down the coffee pot and looked at him directly. "I told you that once before in a way that wasn't entirely clear. I'm being clear now. You should be cooking in places where people understand what they're eating. This is the path to that." She picked up the pot again. "Don't make a thing of it." Theo stood at the counter. He was quiet for long enough that Dorothy had moved to the far end before he spoke. "I'll come back," he said. She didn't turn around. "I know you will," she said. She meant it. The days that followed moved with the accelerated, disorienting quality of days in which things that have been stuck for a long time suddenly become unstuck all at once. Briggs was held without bail, the federal charges presenting a profile that the magistrate apparently did not find conducive to pretrial release. Walt Greer tendered his resignation the morning after the arrest and retained a lawyer by noon, which Dorothy considered to be an accurate measure of how much confidence he had in the positions he had taken. Clem Rafferty from his holding cell provided the federal investigators with a detailed account of the arrangements that had operated in Harlan County for the better part of a decade, which Dorothy gathered from the reporting was both comprehensive and damning, and which explained several things about the county that she had always known were wrong without being able to prove. Sheriff Boyd Utterer issued a written statement expressing his full cooperation with the federal investigation. He resigned 3 days later, which Dorothy considered to be the most honest thing he had done in his tenure. The bikers stayed. Not all 200, the column had dispersed gradually through the first week, the men returning to Atlanta and Birmingham and Nashville, And wherever else they had come from in ones and twos and small groups, the way a gathering returns to its constituent parts when the central reason for gathering has been addressed. But 10 stayed. A core of them, Preacher and Goliath and Wrench and Sketch, and 5 others rented the old auto body shop 3 blocks down from the diner on a month-to-month lease and opened a motorcycle repair and custom shop that was, as far as Dorothy could determine, a legitimate business operated with the efficiency of people who knew their trade well and had decided to apply it honestly. They became the kind of presence in Harlan County that had no precise category. If a car broke down on Highway 31 at midnight, a biker would stop. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. They would just stop because they had been on that road at that hour and they had the tools. If someone was bothering the kids at the park on Route 9 on weekend afternoons, a man in a leather cut would appear at the park's edge and stand there with crossed arms until the bothering stopped and then disappear without a word. He was working at their garage, learning the work with the focused intensity of someone who had found for possibly the first time a task that fit the shape of his attention and his hands. He was good with engines. He was methodical in a way that surprised people who had formed an impression of him based on the cut in the beard and the general physical presentation of a man who had arrived at a diner bleeding from a wound he had earned running from the law. He came into the diner every morning for breakfast. He sat at the counter. He ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy hash browns, wheat toast, black coffee, with the comforting regularity of someone who had found a place where the routine was something to hold on to rather than escape from. Dorothy cooked his eggs herself most mornings. She did not make a point of this. It was simply what happened. His father called him on a Tuesday. Dorothy didn't hear the call, and Ridley didn't describe it. But he came in the following morning with a different quality about him. Something settled. Something that had been unresolved for a long time that had found, if not a resolution, then at least a form it could hold without continuing to cost him everything. He ate his eggs. He left the tip on the counter, the way he always did more than was necessary. One evening, closing time in the 3rd week of November, Dorothy was turning off the last of the kitchen lights when she heard the front door and the bell above it. She came out of the kitchen to find Preacher at the counter. He had come in quietly the way he did most things, and he was sitting on the stool at the end, the one nearest the register, the one he had first occupied on the morning he had put the $100 on the counter and asked for coffee, and he had a glass of iced tea that he had apparently poured himself from the pitcher she kept on the back counter. She looked at the tea and looked at him. "I helped myself," he said. "I noticed," she said. She came around the counter and poured herself the last of the evening's coffee and leaned against the back counter and looked at him in the quiet of the closed diner. The highway dark and ordinary outside the window, the neon sign burning steady above the door. "You're in Earl's spot," she said. He looked down at the stool. He looked up at her. "Ridley told me about him," he said, "about the diner, what he built." "Ridley's been talking," Dorothy said. "He has," Preacher said. "More than he used to. That's new." He turned the iced tea glass on the counter slowly, a single rotation. "I heard Earl turned down 3 offers for this place." "He did." "What did he say when he turned them down?" Dorothy drank her coffee. "He said, 'Over my dead body,'" she said, 3 times, with increasing sincerity. Preacher looked at the counter. Something in his expression shifted, small, barely visible, but present. The kind of shift that happens in a person's face when they encounter something that confirms a thing they already believed but had not yet found confirmed. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. Dorothy looked at the man sitting in her dead husband's spot in her closed diner at the end of a month that had contained more than most years. She looked at the proclamation on the wall and the fixed sign outside and the clean counter and the list on the register that was shorter now than it had been. The prep sink fixed the cracked tile, replaced a number of the items addressed by hands other than her own over the past 3 weeks. "He was the best man I knew," she said. "For a long time I thought there wouldn't be another category for that." She looked at Preacher. "I was wrong about that." Preacher was quiet. He drank his tea. Outside on Highway 31, a truck passed with its headlights on, the light sweeping briefly through the front windows and then moving on. From down the street came the distant sound of motorcycles, not many. Just a few, the low, easy sound of engines that were not being pushed, moving at a comfortable pace on a quiet evening road. "We're not leaving," Preacher said. "Not as an announcement. as a statement of settled fact. I know, Dorothy said. Harlan County's got clean air and cheap rent, he said. Inadequate food, Dorothy said. The corner of his mouth moved. Inadequate food, he agreed. Dorothy finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup and set it on the drying rack and picked up her keys in her coat. Lock the door when you go, she said. Yes, ma'am, Preacher said. She went out through the back and across the parking lot to her station wagon. The night was cold and clear, the stars visible in the wide Alabama sky, in the particular abundance that required darkness to see the kind of darkness that small towns still had and larger places had traded away without fully understanding what they were trading. She sat in the car for a moment before starting it, the keys in her lap, looking up through the windshield at the stars. She thought about Earl. She thought about the summer of 2003 and the dent in the bat and the list on the register and the sign that was fixed now and burning steady on the front of the building he had built with his own hands on a July weekend in 1987. She thought about a man in a Hell's Road cut bleeding on her floor and a taser crackling in the quiet of her diner and 200 engines ticking and cooling in her parking lot in the morning. Quiet and a young man coming through a broken window with a rusted shotgun and terror in his face, and something unbending underneath the terror that had nothing to do with age or race or experience and everything to do with the kind of person he had decided to be. She thought about what it meant to hold a thing together. Not the diner specifically. The thing underneath the diner. The thing that the diner was made of and had always been made of the same substance that Earl had mixed into the concrete when he poured the foundation that she had mixed into every morning's worth of eggs and coffee and clean counter and honest work in the 31 years since. The substance that did not have a precise word for it, but that you could recognize without difficulty when you saw it in another person the way you recognize a quality of light. She had seen it in Theo when he climbed through the window. She had seen it in Preacher when he stepped into her ruined doorway with his phone in his hand. She had seen it in Ridley when he looked at her from the counter stool with blood on his shirt and said, please. She had been seeing it her entire life in the mirror, though she had not always had the language for what she was looking at. She started the car. She pulled out of the lot and onto Highway 31 heading south. Behind her, the sign of Reeves' Table burned steady in the November dark red, orange, and clear. No flicker, no failure visible from a long way down the road in either direction. Earl's sign, her sign, still there. She drove home under the Alabama stars and the road ahead was long and lit, and she knew the way.